Hello and welcome to this episode of the DigiPod on DawnNews English. Today I am joined by Asfandyar Farrukh, who is a member of the National Ecommerce Council. Today we are speaking about digital payments and digital services. Asfandyar, for the audience, could you tell us what kind of digital services are being utilized by Pakistani users?
Sure. Thanks, I'll be happy to. So I think when you look at digital services, there are sort of a whole variety of services that people use. So whether they're individuals, who are using streaming platforms or other platforms, but I think when we look at the business sphere, primarily, there are freelancers that use different services. Then we have IT companies that have sort of specific services they use. But on the whole, a lot of businesses and most of the businesses in Pakistan use, a wide variety of services. Primarily, if you look at it, it would be digital advertising. So any business, I think of any scale will advertise on social media, digital media, through the likes of Meta, Google, TikTok, YouTube, and others. Then we have website and email hosting that people use, for their different purposes. Every business has a website now. They use email addresses, so they'll use different services like GoDaddy and Hostinger or multiple, or Google even, for example. And I think along with that is cloud storage. So like cloud storage, I think, is very widely used. I mean, we have for businesses that want to use or for host their portals, their services, their softwares, or even the documents, for example. So people are using Dropbox, Google Workspace, Amazon Web Services, Azure, and all these sort of services. Along with that, there are a lot of tools that people use for their businesses that are, the likes of for accounting, for HR, for CRMs, other particular sector-specific tools that are people using like Adobe, QuickBooks, Zendesk, and many others. And of course, e-commerce platforms, which we have a lot of e-commerce businesses are using Shopify, WordPress, and these kind of services. And all of these services primarily are based abroad internationally. So we don't have many options locally. And so this is basically maybe the majority or the bigger ones that digital services that people are using in Pakistan.
So there's a wide array of services that are being used, and they're typically hosted internationally. What is the payment system that is set up in terms of acquiring and purchasing these packages from these companies?
Primarily, the companies offer their services through card payments, right? And other sort of modes which aren't available in Pakistan, for example, PayPal and others. But primarily, they all enable users to pay by credit cards or debit cards. So that's one major way. Some of the bigger ones, for example, in the advertising space, Google, Meta, and all, they have certain credit lines where you can actually send larger sums of money through remittances or through bank transfers, international bank transfers. But that's limited, right? That's only in the case, and that's primarily for larger businesses that are transacting in tens of thousands of dollars or $100,000. But by and large, we see that most of the digital service providers are accept payments in smaller amounts because the frequency of payments are normally very, very daily or weekly or monthly in nature, and sometimes very rarely annual. So in that case, then and the ticket size is also generally small. For each transaction. So they generally accept card payments or through international wallets.
And what is the government policy around this? Because recently some consumers have reported that banks are blocking their payments. And there's this distinction between corporate cards and individual cards, and if you are media companies through the cards. Could you explain what this is about?
Well, I'd have to do that. Just to give you some background, first of all, in 2020, the State Bank sort of issued a circular about a facility called the Remittances to Digital Service Provider Companies in the Foreign Exchange Manual, Chapter 14. So in that, they allowed larger businesses or for payments to be done to a white list of businesses for payments for digital services. And this was primarily through that international bank transfer mode. And that was primarily for large businesses that have banking relationships and can make those payments, against their relationships and send those payments out to these companies. So that was a good thing. I think that to give that kind of option there, in addition to the sort of card payments option. But in November 2022, we saw that the State Bank issued a circular in November stating that two things. Number one, limit of $30,000 per individual per CNIC for payments through their cards. Now, this could be for business, this could be, I mean, this could be for any purpose really. And at the same time, they clarified, which is one of the regulations that has been there in the past, that personal cards cannot be used for commercial transactions. And that I think has created sort of a big disruption because in Pakistan, I mean, you have those big bank transfers that some businesses or larger businesses can do, and that they were able to do from 2020 onwards, in only for those large entities. But in general, Pakistanis have been paying through their personal cards, for services, for commercial purposes, for their business purposes, and that's something that's been going on and it's been practiced. But then the state bank through the commercial banks restricted this, and the alternative is actually to have corporate cards, as you mentioned. But the corporate cards are barely issued by maybe 2 or 3 banks. And as per the state banks, regulations, corporate cards are primarily only because they're also it's an old sort of facility available, are primarily for travel and entertainment purposes. So that's not actually covering all the commercial transactions you need to do in this day and age, and for digital services. So interestingly, now we're seeing that banks, after perhaps pressure from the state bank, after analyzing these transactions that are being done through personal cards, the banks have started restricting, and now you can't even use those cards, although even after 2022 November, people were still using them because they had to transition some way or the other. But the alternative of corporate cards is not really available because issuing them is very cumbersome. Very few banks do it. It's cumbersome because you have to, in many cases, qualify for those corporate cards based on your business history, based on banking relationships, based on even deposits in some cases. And those corporate cards aren't even of any use for this, actually, because they're restricted to travel and entertainment purposes only, as we've been informed, for example. So now, what do people do, right? So now we're having these limits being put on increasingly so, which is, I think, creating, pushing people to use other channels and other sources which aren't necessarily, through the formal method.
Well, then what do smaller entities do if there isn't, so to speak? I mean, if corporate cards were the alternate, but then that is also limiting and they are reliant on services. What is it that they can do? Or do you feel that there's something that the government needs to revisit, or the state bank, in terms of policy, the way that this is being rolled out or enforced at this moment?
This is definitely a big question, and this has become more and more disruptive as more and more restrictions are forced based on the various policies. I think one thing for sure is that there has to be a way for these personal cards to be linked with businesses, right? If we want to ensure that these are not being used for other purposes, but perhaps maybe the reason from what we understand, and not that it's an official line, but we understand that people have been making payments for cryptocurrency, for example, in the past, or other things. So there is a certain thing that people are not supposed to use their cards for, but at least if they're using for genuine, legitimate business purposes, and they don't have corporate cards right now, the rollout or the option of getting corporate cards is not easy or available to most Pakistanis, then the personal card should be linked to their businesses, and they should be allowed based on their business profile, which should also be maybe submitted or registered, and then they should be allowed to transact through those cards for legitimate purposes like advertising or digital tools or other services that they need for their livelihoods, for their business purposes. So I think that's something that the state bank and the policymakers in general should definitely find a solution for, because it's possible, and we have different forums and different bodies have proposed different options, but unfortunately there hasn't been much headway yet. So I think this is definitely one thing. And in addition to this is also the taxation structure on these transactions.
And also, since you belong to the e-commerce industry, what are the impediments how payment systems are set up? And often the question that a lot of people ask is, but why isn't there PayPal in Pakistan, right? So in terms of various payment mechanisms, when we travel outside of Pakistan, it's fairly easy. There's a lot of cashless transactions and various ways to transfer money, whether personally or professionally. What is it that is lacking in Pakistan that we need to now fill that sort of gap?
I think we have, transfers and digital payments really taking off in Pakistan within domestically speaking, whether it's cards, whether it's now even the wallet payments and the RAS payments and interbank transfers really grown. So I think that's a good thing. I think we are seeing a lot of activity there, and the numbers speak for themselves. I think the bigger issue is how to transact, with international for clients and customers and inflows and outflows. So generally, I mean, if you look at the last few years, especially, there have been restrictions on outflows of funds, which is probably one of the reasons why these cards restrictions have also been put in place. And that's generally a problem where if we, a lot of these international payment providers like PayPal, even Alipay, Google Pay, and a lot of the others, they are only comfortable when there's when there's seamless or unrestricted inflow and outflow. I mean, you can't have, for example, expecting that PayPal will come to Pakistan or partner with a payment provider in Pakistan if they can only send payments in and nobody can use that to pay outside Pakistan or pay for other things outside Pakistan, businesses or any services or goods that they want to buy. So I think the challenge is that, because of these sort of this approach due to economic reasons, perhaps, that we are restricting sort of the outflow. So then the inflow also gets restricted because these sort of services are not comfortable, in maybe having this kind of. But at the same time, I would still say that we have a few players like SadaPay and others who have sort of for freelance payments, they are now linking with, partners who are working with PayPal and others. But that's only restricted to certain use cases or certain types of transactions. Because for freelancers in general, you're seeing more more ease in terms of getting payments now. But I think for other businesses, it's still a challenge.
And finally, do you see any impact on the digital economy in terms of the potential there is for revenue generation, or even from the government's point of view, perhaps taxation opportunity?
Yes, I think there's definitely two things I would like to point out. One is that now because of these restrictions and increasingly so, we're seeing now people use informal channels. For example, third parties who have maybe have accounts abroad or can make payments on their behalf abroad. So that's doing is then you are maybe, and people are, as a result, also businesses as they scale are also creating entities abroad so that they can then receive their money abroad or send money abroad and easily transact for their business purposes. So that's creating sort of, and we've seen this maybe in the IT sector reportedly over the last couple of years, where people say that people aren't bringing all the IT processes in Pakistan, and I think that applies now to many other sectors perhaps, where they are keeping their funds abroad partially in order to not necessarily to escape taxes, but to actually be able to pay for services abroad, right, easily and on time. So if you aren't able to pay on time, then you're and the restrictions have created this issue where if you have this limit, then if you once you hit that limit, your payments get stuck. So that disrupts businesses. You can't advertise then. You have to find another source, or your subscription ends, and you have to find another alternative. So that creates disruption for businesses, individuals, smaller businesses especially. So that I think is creating sort of a lag and a sort of a drag on businesses and the ability to freely work, because now without digital services, I think no business can survive, let alone grow. And I think one more thing I would like to add here is the taxation. So in 2024, late 2023 and 2024 onwards, now even on these card transactions, we have, especially on the Sindh Revenue Board and the Punjab Revenue Authority have also added sales tax, which are now being collected these transactions to the likes of Google, Meta, etc., to the extent of 15 to 16%, which also adds, a cost. On IT services and other tools as well, there's a 3 to 5% sales tax, which is not exorbitant, I would say. So they're now looking at this as a revenue sort of spinner as well, because these businesses are not based in Pakistan. So they're sort of loading taxes on them. And I think that's still something that's a global issue. But at the same time, the taxes should be reasonable, right? So advertising, the rates are very high, which adds into the cost of business. And because these are personal cards, you can't even sort of adjust that tax, as a business. So that there are various complexities involved, which are becoming more and more complicated and more restrictive, and for people to, and the digital economy as a whole, because the digital economy survives on these digital services. And until we have local sort of alternatives in different space, a long time, in my opinion, we should be able to at least use these international services without too many restrictions, even if they have to be taxed to a certain extent, or there have to be certain limits, or at least checks and balances on who is using these services, business purposes or not. which can be done, in my opinion.
As we round out this conversation, are there any specific recommendations that you would want to make, or that have already been made earlier, and you've of course spoken about this as well, that you would really like to underscore to especially address this issue in the immediate sort of aftermath of how payments are being stalled?
As I mentioned earlier, I think one of the things is definitely to be able to rationalize sort of the restrictions on personal cards being used, because that's a very big issue right now. And link it with businesses or people who are doing business of any scale. I think that's something that's very doable and needs to be done. Secondly, of course, corporate cards, the restriction on corporate cards like this, sort of, I would say that these are old fashioned or old sort of not, these regulations need to be updated. And I think at the same time, we need to look at how we can create an environment where this inflow and outflow of funds is sort of a bit easier for businesses and people who want to do legitimate business through these channels, through these modes of payment. So that then we also can hope for in the future for international payment service providers to come in and partner and grow and look at this market seriously, not just our domestic growth happening in the payment space, but also internationally nationalized, so that they are we have different taxes on these transactions through everybody on their statements are now getting all kinds of taxes which they don't understand a lot of the time, and it's also being haphazardly implemented, which I think needs to be rationalized as well by the provincial and federal tax authorities, because this is adding complexity and also I think this is and costs which are I think going to only be harmful for the digital economy.
Thank you, Asfandyar, for making time for DawnNews English. This is all we have on the DigiPod today. It is imperative that the government or policymakers take into account the fact that the ease and cost of doing business has to be looked at if we want to, improve our digital economy, inclusion, and realize a digital Pakistan, the slogan that we keep hearing. Thank you very much.